I'd like to call to order the regular Planning Commission meeting, September 26, Oak Harbor, that is. First item is roll call. All commissioners are present this evening. At this time, I'd like to welcome our newest member, Kevin Austinson. He replaces Lisa Merriman's position 5, term ending March of 2020. Welcome, Kevin. Next item is approval of the minutes, August 22nd. Do I have a motion?
Move we accept the minutes as presented.
I second it.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? It passes. The next item, as we always do, is the public comment item. And as I always announce, the Planning Commission accepts public comment for items not otherwise on the agenda for the first 15 minutes of the Planning Commission meeting. So if anyone has anything other than the 4 items that we have on the agenda this evening, you're welcome to speak at this time. Seeing no takers. Oh, okay. If you would state your name and your address.
My name is Cheryl Gabalowski, and I live here on the island, 907 Northeast Lindsay Street. I just heard in the meeting that they're planning on trying to extend the Planning Commission to allow non-residents to partake or be members of the Planning Commission if they own a business on the island. I absolutely oppose that because I feel that big developers could have a small real estate business here, and that would suffice to get them on our Planning Commission. To me, the Planning Commission should be for members who live on this island, enjoy and respect the quality of life on this island, not from big developers who are out to make money or businesses from off-island, which that push is only going to continue from off-island because the real estate in Seattle and the whole area is going up and up and up, and I don't want to see this island turned into Bainbridge Island. I've watched the overdevelopment on the island just in the last 10 years, and I think that most residents on this island want to keep the island atmosphere that we have. That's why we live here versus the mainland. That's why we put up with the commutes, the drive up over a bridge or a ferry. You know, we live here for a reason, and it's because we don't want to live in an overdeveloped urban environment. That's all.
Thank you. Any other comments at this time? Seeing none, I close that part of our meeting. I would like to let the audience know at this time that the items on the agenda this evening are all public meetings. None of the items will we take any action on this evening. And because it's not hearings, public meetings only, when you make comments, if your neighbor has said it already, perhaps you could save it for the actual public hearing, which is coming on down the road. At this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Powers, who will address the first agenda item, joint planning area amendment. The city recently asked Island County to consider amending the joint planning area. The joint plan area is immediately outside and adjacent to the city's urban growth. Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Wassinger. Again, Steve Powers, Director of Development Services. I'll have the staff presentation for the commission this evening. As you saw from your agenda as well as your agenda packet, the city did recently ask Island County to consider expanding the joint planning area. And so what I have for you this evening is a PowerPoint presentation that's intended to try to get you up to speed with that topic, that coupled with the materials that we'd provided in your agenda packet. So without further ado, I'll just jump right in. What I really want to do this evening for you is to give you some background on the countywide planning policies, because I think it's important for you to have some background on that so that we can talk about the background of the joint planning area. Of course, I feel a little silly talking to you about the countywide planning policies because most of you helped us with their adoption a little over a year ago, and then the amendments just here somewhat recently. But for the benefit of the members of the audience, as well as our newest planning commissioner, maybe that will be time well spent. So we're going to talk a little bit about countywide planning policies. We'll talk a little bit about some background on the joint planning area. We'll talk about how did staff go about creating 2 options that we sent to the county for their review, speak a little bit about the coordination with Island County, then next steps, what are the next steps in the process. As always, we're going to be available to help you with your questions, and we'd welcome your comments and feedback. And then we would also suggest that you take public comment as well. I'm going to apologize in advance. There are a lot of acronyms, not quite as many as I think maybe the next item, but we're going to talk about GMA and UGA for urban growth area and countywide planning policies and JPAs. So be kind of acronym heavy this evening. So for the countywide planning policies, you know, it's a policy agreement between Island County and the municipalities within. It's an important point. You know, we tend to think about it only in terms of the relationship between Oak Harbor and Island County, but it's actually an agreement that applies to the town of Coupeville and to Langley as well. And then also actually covers how the county handles the Freeland non-municipal urban growth area. So while we tend to think of it just about Oak Harbor, it also involves the other communities. Those countywide planning policies provide policy statements which establish a framework for our comprehensive plans. In short, state law says that the county's comprehensive plan and the city's comprehensive plan should be consistent with each other. And so obviously we need a starting point to figure out how we're going to have that conversation, how we're going to make sure the plans are consistent, and what's the framework that we're going to put into place that guides us in those various conversations. That's what the countywide planning policies do. They cover a range of topics. I've only listed some which are sort of directly related to the topics we'll be talking about this evening. So how is a joint planning area established? How are lands designated within it? And how do lands potentially transition from a joint planning area to an urban growth area? One other piece of background, which I know the commission is very familiar with, is that there were some amendments approved by the city and the county earlier this year. Council approved those amendments on July 26th with Resolution 1713. You saw them in advance of the council. So let's switch gears then to joint planning areas. First off, and foremost, there is an existing joint planning area. It's been in place for quite some time, and so I'll show you a map of that existing boundary in just a moment. As I just referenced for you, Resolution 1713 was recently adopted by the council. It followed the county's adoption of this same language. But also as part of that resolution, when we approved the amendments to the countywide planning policies, the council also formally requested the county consider expanding our joint planning area. They set a general direction through their policy statement. They said they'd like to see the JPA grow to the south and to the southwest, and that they actually did request that the lands be designated priority growth area as consistent with the language of the countywide planning policies. I'll take a quick diversion here for a moment to say this is not the first time that the city made the formal request of the county to think about expanding the JPA. We've been talking with county staff about that now for probably almost a year, feels like, certainly 9 months time frame. We made a request in writing from staff to staff earlier this year. In fact, I think it was in one of our comment letters on the countywide planning policies. So they had that staff-to-staff communication that, hey, this seems like a good time for us to be having this conversation. And then the council also added their voice to that when they adopted that resolution in July. So the county says, great, we're willing to talk to you, but please give us a map so that we know what you're thinking about. And then they also wanted us to talk about how the property would be designated, and I'll get to that in a moment. That leads me to the last bullet point on this slide, which is how lands inside of a joint planning area are designated affects its ability to either be or not be in an urban growth area, and I think you're all pretty familiar with that language in the document. A couple more acronyms to add to our list. PGA, which is priority growth area, and AGA, which is auxiliary growth area. So this is a map of the existing JPA, and the draft stamp is from when we were working with the county earlier this year, so it is not, in fact, a draft. So I'm going to use the screen over behind the table where I was sitting. The area that is in the pale yellow, that is property which is currently within the city limits. The palish purple color is property or lands which are inside of the existing urban growth area, but are still in unincorporated Island County. So when you take them together, what that means is that this general outline like this is the boundary of our existing urban growth area. So these areas outlined in the darker color line with the darker colors on them, or just the plain white, these are areas that are in fact part of the existing joint planning area. And so you might recall that the blue color on that map reflects the areas which have been designated as priority growth areas inside of our existing joint planning area. The areas in red are those areas which are the auxiliary growth areas. And an important point is that there's nothing that says that all lands have to be designated one or the other. There's nothing wrong with leaving it undesignated, and that's why we see some of this property just plain white on the map. So again, main point of that map was to orient the commission and the community to our existing joint planning area boundary. Here is the southern portion of that joint planning area. So a different map with a little bit different focus for you in terms of the geography. Again, using that same screen. In this case, the white areas are the city properties which are in the city right now. The goldish color properties are the ones which are still within inside the urban growth area, but are still in unincorporated Island County. This dashed line represents the edge of our existing urban growth area. This pattern here is the edge of the existing joint planning area. These blues and reds match up to the blues and reds on the previous page. We're showing you this map because the council in their resolution set the policy directive that they would request that the joint planning area expand to the south and to the southwest. So how do we go about thinking about establishing what the boundary is for a joint planning area? This graphic is intended to show you sort of three big keys which are part of that thought process. So the first part of this graphic is just the joint planning area itself. It's lands which are adjacent to the urban growth area, and these are all pulled straight out of the countywide planning policy. So if you look at the definition of a joint planning area, it's going to tell you that it's adjacent to the UGA. It's close to urban services. It has some level of connection to transportation, either existing corridors or proposed corridors. Generally, we try to avoid including lands of commercial significance, read commercial ag for that, and that the boundaries of the joint planning area hopefully are somewhat logical. They don't go all over the place with zigs and zags. We try to keep them straight. We try to have them follow logical breaks from a geographical perspective, and you try not to create donut holes or islands, if you will, inside of your joint planning area. So that's the overarching concept of what do we think about, how do we think about establishing the boundary. So the next piece of that graphic is, the next two pieces are focused on how might we go think about lands inside of there in terms of their designations. Both of these blocks also come straight out of the countywide planning policies. Again, that agreement between us and the county that says these are how we're going to look at lands in this area that we both have a shared interest in thinking about and planning for. So priority growth areas I mentioned before, those are lands which are the ones which, if you're going to expand an urban growth area, are the ones that you should think about first. So with that in mind, typical things are that they're going to perhaps be urban in character or have somewhat urban character. Perhaps they have some limited form of urban services already. And generally, they're seen as a logical and cost-effective expansion of the existing urban growth area. So those are the basic characteristics of properties which might get the label of priority growth area. And of course, I'm simplifying this. As the Planning Commission knows, there's a number of steps and a lot of text in the countywide planning policies that give us direction as to how this works. But I'm trying to condense it onto a graphic for you. So the final block over then is that auxiliary growth area. So these are properties that aren't going to be the first ones that leaped ahead in your mind, rather, when you think about adding to an urban growth area. And so they're, again, designated auxiliary growth area. They may be constrained by critical areas or substantially constrained by critical areas. They may have cultural or social benefits that have a regional or island-wide significance. They may likely include commercial significant properties, again, that commercial agriculture. And although it's not relative to the area of the island that we're talking about, in other areas, the APZ comes into play. And so these are all characteristics of land which, absent other sets of circumstances, you would not think about including in your urban growth area, or if you did, they wouldn't be your first or second choice. So with that in mind, then, and that basic parameter, we set about identifying two options for the county to consider as part of the process of working with us on the joint planning area. Seemed like we had one that did better with the street names. I know that we've provided one for the Planning Commission. Maybe it's just washing out and I can't see it as well. So to orient everybody, again, here we have the edge of the existing urban growth area. We have properties which are in the city. We have properties which are still in the county but in the urban growth area. This is the edge, southern edge of the existing joint planning area. So option A was put together based upon the language you find in the CWPPs. We thought about those lands which are sensitive and that perhaps we need to have some joint planning with the county. And so that's what took the proposed boundary to be coincident with the boundary of the East Preserve. Lands that both of us should be thinking about and looking at as we think about planning topics. We tried to have it follow logical street lines and or be straight. We did not include any donut holes, obviously, in this, and we've included land that is close to where our existing services end. We have water and sewer that gets to the southern end of the urban growth area. And I think I have a slide that summarizes some of these points in just a moment. But this was identified as option A. Option A is a relatively large option, and we acknowledge that to the county. Option B, same orientation, same map, except rather than extending to this point on the west, stops at this point here, and then follows this rectilinear pattern, and then comes along to this particular point here. Same proximity to urban services as the previous one. Here's that summary slide that I referenced earlier. So again, we provided two options to the county for their thought process. We thought that that was better than just sending them a single map. We wanted to have some flexibility to start the conversation with them. Option A, as I acknowledge, is a rather large option, and frankly may be too large to think about at this particular point in time. But there were some logical reasons from a purely planning perspective that we thought that boundary made sense. But as you can see on the screen, it's over 2,000 acres in size. Option B is less than half that size, at about 960 acres. Again, some of the same characteristics are shared between the two of them. Both of them, we believe, are consistent with the policy directive the council gave us through the resolution in terms of their general location to the south and or southwest. Both are consistent with certain aspects of the countywide planning policies. We use the sensitive lands as a boundary. That's something that you see listed in the countywide planning policies. We include straight boundary lines. We were avoiding those donut holes, and then we have some proximity to services. Let me focus on that donut hole one for just a moment. And this is where the exercise becomes somewhat interesting, because there's no perfect answer to lots of these different scenarios. So on one hand, we have a policy that tells us that you shouldn't create enclaves or donut holes inside of an area. Another one, you have a policy that says, well, maybe we shouldn't really include commercial ag land either. And so we looked at it and we decided that what seemed to make the most sense to us at this time was to not try to create the donut holes, acknowledge that that land is included. Doesn't mean that it becomes part of an urban growth area. It doesn't mean that there's any change into it. It just would mean that if this map was, either one of these maps are accepted, we would see those lands inside of that joint planning area. So the second part of it, again, once you have the boundary, is to try to figure out how do you designate lands inside of that boundary. First and foremost, we look to the policies to give us direction on that. Secondly, our basic thought was for those lands which could be assigned the priority growth area designation under the policies, that would be reasonable to do. It's clear that not all lands can be designated as priority growth area. That's okay. We follow those policies. There are some options within the countywide planning policies that give the city and the county an opportunity to talk about how those lands should be designated or designated at all. And we've asked the county to consider those options as we continue our conversation with them. That takes me to this slide, which is the coordination with the county. We've been in a fairly regular communication with them now for quite some time on this topic. Planning Commission's well aware of that in all of our interactions with them on the policies themselves. And I will say that the joint planning area conversation is included on their comprehensive plan docket for this year. It's also part of what we have on our docket. And so we built our schedule to try to match the county's schedule. So our meetings with you, our meetings with the city council, our actual hearing dates, these are all intended to work in concert with the schedule that the county has put out for their process. Finally, the last bullet point on this slide is that the county did formally ask us to provide them a map. We provided the 2 maps. We provided a letter that really said much more eloquently the things that I've said for you this evening, and we provided that to them on September 11th. So what are the next steps in this process? Obviously tonight we're here with the Planning Commission. As Chairman Wassinger noted, this is a public meeting. We're not yet ready for a public hearing with you folks. Tomorrow afternoon we have our workshop with the City Council. This will be the second touch point for them because we briefed them last week at their regular meeting. And then in terms of the Planning Commission, we intend to, we've scheduled a special meeting for you on October 10th. Those would be hearings, both for this item and the next item. We'd ask for you then to make a recommendation to the council. Council would consider that at their meeting on the 17th. And then we would forward our recommendations on to the council or to the county after that. We built some extra dates in here in case they become necessary. The 24th for you folks and the 25th for the council at a workshop. So again, this schedule is intended to work in concert with the county's schedule. So our recommendation to you this evening, again, it's a discussion item only, no action. Certainly want your feedback and we want to help you with your questions. And then we do recommend that you take public comment this evening, especially since we have a number of folks here who would like to speak on the topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Commissioners, you have any comments, questions at this time?
Steve, one thing I may have missed, I believe you said this, but how long has the city been working towards amending the JPA to the south?
I'll answer that with 2 pieces if I could. We've always talked about that the logical place for us to grow, given our physical constraints, would be to the south or to the southwest. That holds true either for the urban growth area or for the joint planning area. Feels to me, and maybe I'll look to CAC for this, it feels to me like we started last fall with our informal conversations with the county staff last fall. But we were also in conversations with them about the countywide planning policy, so these 2 subjects go together. So roughly this time last year is when we started the conversation.
Sure. And to follow up with that, when was the last time the city requested a joint planning?
We never have.
Never have?
Never have. We've had the same boundary as long as I've been here, which is 19 years. To the best of my knowledge, that's the boundary that was established at the time that the original countywide planning policies were put into place and that the original urban growth area was established for Oak Harbor. So this is the first time we've done that.
Thank you.
Any other? Hal?
So, Steve, I apologize. Are we going to come back to us again after the public comments, or?
Typically, we can do either, I suspect.
I'm sorry, I'm happy to stay here and answer your questions.
Well, while you're up here. So is the size of the JPA constrained the way that, for example, the city limits might be on population projections? Or is the JPA simply something that we feel we need to have an opportunity to express an opinion on what happens there with the county?
It's a great question. It is not constrained in the same fashion that an urban growth area is.
Okay.
So, through the Growth Management Act and through the case law, UGAs can't be sized too big. We don't have that same guidance on joint planning areas. So there's much more latitude and discretion for the jurisdictions to determine what makes sense for them.
Okay. Yeah, and I've been an advocate for a long time of moving the JPA out in that direction. I find it kind of astonishing right now that the JPA is so small and the county can make decisions on land use very close to the current, city limits in UGA. For example, putting a trailer park in where there's one going in on Balder Road without the city having any opportunity. Proposed, thank you. Without the city having any opportunity to really address it because it's outside the JPA.
Well, it is intended to be an area where we have frequent communication with each other and to talk about topics of mutual interest. And it doesn't necessarily relate to just land development. There can be other topics that are of mutual interest. It can be transportation planning. It can be open space planning. It can be natural resource planning. There's a whole series of things that we could have conversationally, or have conversations about rather, inside of the JPA. Certainly part of it is hopefully making decisions in concert so that decisions in the rural environment work with the urban and vice versa.
Thank you.
So I believe at this time I'll go ahead and remind the audience that to speak during a scheduled public hearing or meeting, please sign in on the sheet provided in the council chambers. To ensure comments are recorded properly, state your name clearly into the microphone. Please limit comments to 3 minutes to ensure all citizens have sufficient time to speak. Comments regarding candidates or ballot measures are not allowed under state law. Individuals participating in a public comment are prohibited from speaking on these subjects and will be asked to stop if these topics are included during the comment period. Having said that, I welcome public comment. I think we're saving ourselves for the next item. Do I have any public comment? If not, Mr. Powers, you can present, if you would, the Wright's Crossing Urban Growth Area Expansion.
All right, before we leave this item, if I may, Mr. Chairman, just as a reminder, we'll be back to you at October 10th meeting, asking for the Planning Commission's recommendation. At that time, I expect that we will provide you a single option map, and we'll move away from the two options. We'll have further communication with the county, and I expect we'll give you one map for your review and recommendation to the council.
Thank you.
Oh, Tim will get me set up here. All right. So the background on this, I'll read just a little bit out of the staff report and then I'll move into the PowerPoint presentation. The background is that there was an application submitted to expand Oak Harbor's urban growth area. It was submitted to Island County because that's the jurisdiction which has authority under state law to size the urban growth areas. That application, as I think everybody is aware, is known as Wright's Crossing. I've included for the Planning Commission the different application numbers, the one that the county is using and the one that the city is using. Part of this review process that the county has involves the city reviewing and commenting on the application. We met the county's original or initial deadline of providing comments to them by August 28th. And we provided a copy of those comments for you as one of your attachments. Our goal this evening then is to acquaint the Planning Commission with this application. I want to spend the majority of my time with you on the actual UGA expansion process itself, because I think that's important for the commission to set the firm groundwork for you. I'm going to just briefly summarize our city comments to date, and then just like on the last item, we'll talk about next steps. So, quick summary slide that you saw in the materials in your packet. The application was submitted to Island County on August 1st. If I summarize that in some quick bullet points, it seeks to expand the Oak Harbor urban growth area by approximately 248 acres. By reviewing their materials, it looks like they are proposing up to 1,500 single-family homes be part of that development. One staff note for you, we made the same note for the council as well, of course, is that additional acreage would be necessary to connect this property that the applicant has made the application for to the existing urban growth area. You can't have a gap. And so that's roughly 50 acres in size. So if you hear me refer to about a 300-acre area, that's why we're using that number. The city provided formal comments to the county on August 28th, and we provided to the Planning Commission a copy of the application as submitted by the applicant, as well as a copy of our comments. So a couple of maps here to help orient you as well as the public to what we're talking about. This is the map, one of the maps that the applicant has provided, but it's a good map to use to get our bearings. So the heavy black line running through an angle, of course, is State Route 20. This yellowish area here is property that's within the urban growth area, but is already within the city limits. This pinkish color is property that's inside of the existing urban growth area, but is still within unincorporated Island County. This gold yellow area here is that gap area, or from the applicant's perspective, is property that they do not have under application. And then the purple area is the area that the applicant included in their formal request to Island County to expand the urban growth area. So the next two slides are maps that the county staff had produced, and we felt that they were good ones to use, and so we stole them without any shame. Cecil, we just took those. Again, folks are accustomed to seeing these configurations now. Here are those lands which are not inside of the application, and then here are the lands that are part of the application. The next map, which I don't obviously expect that the commission or the audience will be able to read that legend along the left-hand side, but it was as part of your packet. The significance of this is because this map shows the county zoning. It also shows those special use characteristics that are associated with certain properties. And those have bearing from the countywide planning policy perspective as to how lands may be designated. So back to that previous item, priority growth area, or the auxiliary growth area, or no designation at all, that's derived from that county zoning. And so that's the value of this map. So the next series of slides will be focused on process, and much like the JPA process, there's a lot more to this in your countywide planning policies. I've tried to boil it down to just the relevant facts for you. First off, the county is the lead. That's established by state law, by the Growth Management Act. The city obviously has a role as well. This process involves multiple steps. It's governed by RCW 3670A, that's the Growth Management Act. It's also governed by that body of WACS, or Washington Administrative Code. And then finally, it's obviously governed by the countywide planning policies. So we have a pretty established framework for both of us to be thinking about this application. County has put together some excellent flowcharts that help take us through this process. And I know that it's part of the Planning Commission's packet. I apologize for the members of the audience. This one's a little tough, but I think I can walk us through this. And the goal of this particular portion of the presentation is to show that it's a very systematic approach, which an application has to go through. And so the very first slide up here, or box up here, is the application complete? Yes, no, and there's a pattern developing here. Either yes it is or no it isn't. If it's no, it kicks you out to the side and you have to do something. So if the answer is no, then additional information needs to be requested. Once you get to an answer of yes, the question is docketing required? Not everything requires docketing. An application to expand an urban growth area does. And so that takes you down to this next yes box and takes you to this next portion of the flow chart. And that, from a county's perspective, is that the proposed docket items need to be provided to their planning commission and to their board of county commissioners. The next piece on the slide is for a review of those proposed docket items by both of those bodies. And then finally, the last piece of that is the board determining whether something should be docketed or not. Yesterday, the County Planning Commission conducted their public hearing on this. My understanding is that their recommendation to the board is that this item be excluded from the 2018 docket. And so that recommendation will be going from their Planning Commission to their Board of County Commissioners. But let's continue along this generalized process. You go through an evaluation, and these three boxes here are really the choices that the county has. They either include something in the docket, they defer it. In other words, they say, well, maybe we should put this on the work plan and do some work on it, but it's not ready for the docket, or they exclude it. It means they're not going to take it up in that following year. Again, that's the recommendation that the County Planning Commission has made. But if something becomes docketed, then the review process begins. And that's really what this next piece of their flow chart is all about. And these are for reviews of an urban growth area expansion or modification application. So that's identified by their type of application up here. So the first part then says reevaluate thresholds. So as you might recall from the countywide planning policies, there are a number of thresholds or trigger events. If one or more of those are met, then the county may consider reevaluating some aspect of the urban growth area. So if the answer is yes, then you look to see whether something was on the docket. If the answer is no, none of those thresholds were met, the item is excluded from the docket. Okay. Next big step here is the buildable lands analysis. So if you get through that first series of reviews as to whether or not that triggering event has occurred, and the answer is yes, and the answer is you're proceeding, then the question is about the buildable lands analysis and a reevaluation of the countywide population projections and allocations. You go through that work, which is a substantial amount of work, and then you're faced with the question, is there capacity for the projected growth within the existing boundaries? If the answer is yes, it moves you out to the side and you're done. No UGA expansion is necessary. If the answer is no, that takes you down to the next box here. And we're required then under the law to look at alternative measures. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that if the capacity analysis says, yes, additional capacity is necessary, it's not an automatic that you get bigger in terms of your land area. First, we need to look at, can we do something inside of the boundaries of the existing urban growth area to increase that capacity? That might be increasing the densities for our zoning districts. It might be upzoning parcels. It might be changing the designations of some from non-residential to residential in order to create more residential land. We're required to look at those things and to share the results of our analysis with the county to talk about what options reasonably exist. And the county, by virtue of our agreement with them, is required to listen to us. And we need to have a good, honest conversation as to whether those things make sense or not. If you've completed that part, and I want to make sure, did we consider the alternatives? If we get to yes, and the conclusion by both parties is that there's no way to get that additional capacity solely by changing things inside of the boundary, then you can look at whether or not the UGA can be expanded. So again, the goal was to demonstrate that there's a fairly well-identified process and a number of steps that we will jointly go through. County will be the lead, but we'll be their partner. Last couple of pieces that didn't show up on their particular handout, so I put together this simple graphic for you, takes us to the question of, if we're going to consider expanding the urban growth area, the question is the size. And it's important to note, and the county's materials note this, that it may not be the size which is proposed by an applicant or by the city if we were the ones initiating the application. Similarly, the last box on the right-hand side is that the location may not be the one which is proposed. It may not be the most logical place. And so even if you get to the point of saying the UGA should be expanded, there are still some other questions that we need to ask ourselves in concert with the county. Good segue into our comments to the county. As you saw, we had a fairly lengthy letter that we provided to them with a variety of comments about the application. I will say that our concluding comment was that the city wasn't in a position to determine whether or not the application was consistent or inconsistent with all of our plans and policies yet, because additional work would be necessary to accomplish. We did point out for the county where we believed that aspects of the application were either consistent or perhaps inconsistent with goals and policies in our urban growth area section, as well as our land use section of our comprehensive plan. So they asked us for information about consistency with the comprehensive plan. We tried to answer that question. They also asked whether or not we've accomplished the alternative measures considered. Somewhat of a challenging question, because until you have the application and you're actually going through it, there's no way that you would have done the alternative measures. What we indicated to the county was that no, we haven't, but yes, we will should that step become necessary. That's an answer the county was comfortable with. Thirdly, they wanted us to comment on the potential location of the UGA boundary revisions. One of the challenging aspects of this type of review is that you first look to your adopted plans. Well, our adopted comprehensive plan, by its very nature, covers the area inside of the urban growth area. It doesn't do anything outside of the existing urban growth area, save a little bit of reference to the joint planning area. So for anything which is outside of that, we don't necessarily have a specific reference or two in the comprehensive plan. So it's difficult for us to comment specifically on the location, but we did give the county some general feedback, which is that the proposal was in the direction of what the council had talked about, and it's in the direction that we have historically spoken about. That's about as far as we were able to go on our comments in that area. Fourth area that we were required to provide some feedback to them is the feasibility of providing urban services and what potential impacts might this have to our capital improvement plan and our transportation improvement plan. That question is actually pretty difficult to answer as well without more understanding of what the project actually entails. Hard for us to talk about impacts to the CIP and to the TIP. Much easier for us to talk about that the project is in general proximity to where our water and sewer lines stop at the southern end of our existing urban growth area right now. It's also obviously adjacent to State Route 20. That's about as far as we were able to go, again, given the preliminary nature of where we are. Should the application continue forward, we will obviously do additional analysis. And then finally, the last part of what we had to do for the county is talk to them about what sort of public participation we envisioned, and we gave them a tentative schedule for the meetings like we had last week and that we're having this week, and that we'll continue to have over the next few weeks. So that's what our comments centered on. That takes me to what I think is the last slide. Next steps. We are in communication with county staff. Our schedule is built around theirs. This slide will look eerily familiar to you. And then we're meeting with the council tomorrow at their workshop, again, to brief them on this issue, to see what additional comments they may have had since their meeting last Tuesday when staff briefed them. This slide should also look familiar. Again, you know where we are tonight. This is the same slide that shows you those same meeting dates that was on the last item. And this is also familiar. We see this is a discussion item only, no action this evening. We are looking for the commission's feedback and questions. And again, we would suggest that you take public comment this evening. That concludes the staff presentation.
Yes, commissioners.
Mr. Powers, you said last night or yesterday that the planning commission for the county had said they would not put it on this year's docket.
Their vote, as I understand, was a vote to exclude the item from the 2018 docket.
So it won't be heard next year at all.
That's just step one. Just like
Step
this,
one.
just like you folks, they are an advisory body. They make a recommendation. So that recommendation is going to the Board of County Commissioners. So the Board of County Commissioners has to make the final decision as to what items get onto their docket or not, just like the City Council makes the decision for Oak Harbor as to what items get on the docket. So County Planning Commission's made the recommendation. County Commissioners will take that up sometime October or November.
So it goes to the county commissioners, and if the county commissioners approve the planning commission for the county of Highland, it will not move forward at this point in time.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Commissioners, any other questions? Hal?
So if the county commissioners do add the UGA expansion to their docket, those next few steps where you said that the potential exists for the location and size to be different than what has showed up in the application, does the city have any formal input into that decision, or is that strictly a county planning policy where any input you might have is only informal?
So the countywide planning policies mandate a process, a collaborative process, and those are agreements that we have with the county. So that sets that framework for our conversation. So it's a formal part of the process, but the county ultimately has the authority under state law to size the urban growth area. And so the final decision rests with them. But and I realize that you're aware of this, Mr. Hovey, but I just want to make sure that we all recognize that before we'd ever get to either of those two steps, there are a number of other steps that would have to take place before you would get there. First and foremost, you'd have to go through the buildable lands analysis, and you'd have to conclude that additional capacity is necessary. And then if you reach that conclusion, then you have to do the alternative measures analysis, and you have to conclude that you can't achieve all of that capacity inside of the existing UGA in some fashion or another. And then you're getting down to those last steps.
At yesterday's County Planning Commission meeting, I was there for the last couple hours of it, I heard a number of times comments by either the planning commissioners or the county staff that they didn't know what the city wants. I was a little bit taken aback by that because I thought it was fairly clear what the city wanted. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. We have provided preliminary comments on both areas that we're discussing this evening. So we've provided preliminary comments on the application that we're talking about, this one, the Wright's Crossing application, but we've also provided preliminary comments on the joint planning area. So they are aware of our initial thoughts. likely that they would desire for us to be more specific. We see this as an evolution, our analysis and our sharing information with them, and I think the county is aware of that.
So in an article in the paper a couple weeks ago, the mayor was quoted as saying that he was looking forward to presenting a resolution to the county. Is that the end result of this process that we're going through right now?
So their county's application process, let me back up. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, almost everything for this evening's conversation has its roots in the countywide planning policy. So in the countywide planning policy, when we talk about the possibility of modifying an urban growth area boundary, we talk about 3 different entities having the ability to initiate that application. One is the county. County could say, we'd like to change your boundary. We want to talk to you about that. The city could say, we'd like our boundary to be changed. We want to talk to the county about it. And then finally, a private party can initiate that application to seek an amendment to the UGA. That's obviously what we have here. If we have a private party initiating that application and that essentially that conversation, there's a policy statement which says that the county won't approve a privately initiated application unless the affected jurisdiction supports that application. I've paraphrased, but that's essentially that language. The county's application process has asked that, and not just for this particular application, but for any application, that the affected jurisdiction submit a resolution from their legislative body, i.e. their city council, to the county in advance of the county taking up the question of whether it should be on the docket or not. And so that's part of this schedule, part of the reason that we're briefing Planning Commission and City Council, part of the reason that we'll be asking you to conduct a public hearing in a little over a week and a half to formulate your recommendation to the City Council. And the Council could take up a resolution at their October 17th meeting if they found that to be what they want to do, to signal to the county that they wish to see this application continue through the process. This schedule was built so that that would happen before the county commissioners would take their action, so that they would have the benefit of either knowing or not knowing, or knowing what the city thinks. If there's no resolution, that sends a message as well. We have a draft resolution in the council packet for their workshop tomorrow, so they could see what that document would look like, and they can be thinking about that as to whether that's something that they're interested in.
Thank you.
Yes.
Assuming that this ever did make it onto the docket, it looks like step 2 moves on to a buildable lands analysis. Is that a review of an existing buildable lands analysis, or will there be a new analysis to take place?
Yes. You'd start with what you had already done. And then presumably we would look to see what data has changed, what information has changed since it was completed. And then input that new information to see if it yields a different answer than the answer we got roughly a year and a half ago. CAC, was that about right? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. That was question 2, was when was the last one done? And question 3 would be, how can we get our hands on a copy of that?
The county is the keeper of that. And so because the county is the one under the countywide planning policy who has the responsibility for running that analysis, we reviewed it. We reviewed aspects of it. So if we don't have a complete copy, it's just not coming to my mind, we can make sure that the Planning Commission has provided one. Mr. Hovey apparently has a copy.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Excuse me, Steve, what would be the process for the 50 additional acres for them to sit there and become part of this process? Because you said that the 250 acres, we have to be side by side, and you needed the additional 50 acres to connect all of that. So for all the property owners in that 50 acres, what's the process for them as far as, do they automatically become in there? Do they have to petition? exactly what happens with them?
It's a great question, Mr. Pearson. I'm just going to take us back to one of those maps. Maybe this was a pretty good one here then. So again, that's those properties in there. And those are the properties that the county has identified as, from their perspective, would need to be part of the urban growth area if this particular application was going forward. What we anticipate doing as part of the notification for your public hearing is that letters will go out to all the property owners inside of this area, both this area as well as the area that's under application. So they'll get a direct mailing and inform them of the hearing here so that they could voice their comments to you about that, and then that would help inform the council on their part of the process. Again, it's the county's decision as to whether lands are included or not. So it's not like annexation where you formally submit a petition. That's a little bit different. But it's the county's decision as to where they would ultimately draw that boundary. Presumably, they listen to public input and determine whether or not property should be in or not. This is just where the county staff started that map drawing process.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comment?
We have to reserve the right to make a few more questions after public.
Certainly. Well, at this time, I think it would be a suggestion, we need to turn it over for public comment. I'm going to speak as I spoke during the last public meeting. To speak during a scheduled public hearing or meeting, please sign in the sheet provided at the council chambers, To ensure comments are recorded properly, state your name clearly into the microphone. Please limit comments to 3 minutes to ensure all citizens have sufficient time to speak. Individuals participating in public comment are prohibited from speaking about candidates or ballot measures. Speaking on these subjects, I will have to immediately stop. At this time, I welcome any public comment.
Once again, my name is Cheryl Gomolowski. I live at 907 Northeast Lindsay, and I'm also retired Navy. I absolutely oppose this Wright's Landing project. A 1,500 house project is essentially putting in another town here. And you're talking about filling in our rural land from Monroe Landing all the way to Oak Harbor. It's not something that fits in with the island atmosphere. We already have a traffic nightmare, especially for people coming from the south of the island during tourist season. We've got one way off the island on the north and one way off on the south, and those of us who live here know that in the summer during tourist season already it takes twice as long to get off of this island. I don't see a 1,500 housing complex fitting in with this island. In 2016, the county completed its buildable land assessment and determined that within the urban growth area that there was an excess, plenty of buildable land. And the issue with that, and we all know that there's vacant lots all over Oak Harbor, that there's dilapidated housing that people could tear down and build on and whatnot, but that costs more money. It's much cheaper to take urban or rural land and put in a huge complex like this than it is to fix up existing property or fill in 5 houses here, 2 houses here within Oak Harbor. But that's the whole reason that Washington State passed that Land Management Act in 1991, to preclude that urban sprawl where people, rather than building in existing areas and building up in some cases versus out, developers just expand into rural areas because it's much cheaper to operate that way. I heard talk at the county meeting about affordable property. on the island. Well, I can tell you there's a lot of realtors on this island who advertise for people from Seattle to move here. Advertising the commute and how it's quicker to take the ferry and the train into downtown Seattle. Well, that's inviting people that are accustomed to spending $500,000 on a house and paying $7,000 a year, $10,000 a year in taxes to move here. Of course they'd like to move here if you're inviting them. But that kind of cancels out the argument about affordable housing, because when realtors start inviting people from Seattle and whatnot to move here, of course our housing's going to become less affordable, as are our property taxes. That's what happened in California as the big money moved north. People sell their houses and they can pay twice what someone who works on the island would pay for a house. But the arguments presented at the county meeting were that there weren't enough affordable housing.
Cheryl, your time is up.
But on the island, for people who work here, and I contend that there is, and that they can build on seaplane base if they need more Navy housing.
Thank you. Do I have other takers for public comment? Yes.
Good evening. My name is Steve Foster. I live at 547 Scenic Heights Road, which is Penn Cove Park, which is the subdivision that is right next to this proposed subdivision. A couple comments. I think that the commissioners need to take into consideration the environmental impact study. That will determine how much growth the Navy is going to provide here. We don't have that information yet, so that's one thing that needs to be taken into consideration. We all admit that there's a horrible traffic problem on SR 20. This proposed subdivision is not going to do anything to improve that situation. People from the base who are being enticed into supporting this are being told that, well, you can live there and you can work at the base. How are they going to get to the base? Okay, that's some things I'd like you folks to consider. There are existing documents. There is already a buildable land analysis that's been done, okay? And I'm sure that the city has been provided with that. So that information already exists. Also, something else for the city to consider is once that subdivision is built, emergency services are going to have to be provided. And that's going to have to be provided by the city, not by the county, because it'll be city property at that point in time. Also, something else is to think about is smart growth, not urban sprawl. And if you look at what these folks are up to, it's urban sprawl. The developers have said, well, we're going to go ahead and provide you with another building land analysis. We'll provide all this documentation. The city doesn't have to do it. The county doesn't have to redo it. And my thoughts on that is keep in mind conflict of interest. So realize where your documentation's coming from and who's paying for it. You know, we don't want to have a situation where you got the fox in the hen house. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
My name is David Williams. I live at 3335 Southwest Grinches Lane in Oak Harbor. My house is the last house in the city limits, and it adjoins the area that is between Wright's Crossing and the existing UGA and city limits. I think what I have is a couple of questions for the commission to consider and for staff to consider. I think Mr. Powers made the point that we would not necessarily have to annex into the city limits all of this property that's between the existing and Wright's Crossing. I believe that the intent is that if Wright's Crossing is to be provided with city utilities and city services, it will be in the city limits, and I believe that in order to avoid the donut hole, it'll be necessary to incorporate into the city limits all of that other land between the existing and the proposed. I would state that that would affect me, and I would state that I am, without reservation, opposed to the Wright's Landing project, just to make it clear where I come from. I think what the city wants is clear, because in the same newspaper article that's been referred to earlier, if I read it correctly, the mayor wishes the staff to interpose no objection to this project. In other words, to support it. I don't know if that constitutes fast track, but that was my impression. I would be curious as to the timeline. A date was given that the Wright's Crossing application was made as 1 August. I spoke personally to the proponent on about the 15th of August, and he informed me that he had already purchased all of that property, or at least had options to buy. And so I don't know how long Wright's Crossing has been in the mill, nor do I know the extent to which the Wright Crossing project might have influenced the year-long interest in moving out to the south and southwest, or if it did. It's a bit concerning, but I think the city, or at least the mayor, would certainly support this project. The characterization of affordable, I think one of the earlier articles, this was presented as something that was done as a magnanimous act to provide badly needed affordable housing, and I think the newspaper quoted someone from the proponent's organization as saying that 10% of this housing would fall into that category. I don't know if that's factual or not. I read it in the Whidbey News-Times. So those are questions that I think the commission would be well served to look into. I think annexation is very real, and it will affect everybody who falls in the interim. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Other public comment?
Tammy Davis, 937 Coview Circle. The thing I'm worried about is schools. We build new schools. That means more money for taxpayers put in for schools. Teachers, they're going to have students 40 to 1. What is the, what are we going to have here? A lot more students in the school. We build new schools. We're going to have more police, we need more money. You know, we're going to have all this more. You know, we're already getting taxed enough, you know, and I oppose this whole thing. You know, you know, this is just too much housing in a little area. I live by there. And it's getting rid of agriculture. Our farms are going away. Yes, I know it's a sign of the times, and I understand that. But you know, our generation, next generation, is always willing to learn about farming and stuff. We still need to know how farming goes. We still need to eat, right? So I have definitely proposed this.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Timothy Smith. I live at 1430 Penn Cove Road. I just had some questions as well. How this development is going to be impacting the Highway 20 stretch from Monroe Landing into town. There's going to be increased traffic. How are access points to the highway going to be managed? Is the state involved, or they're going to have to be involved? It's going to impact all the way into town. How is this going to impact existing businesses like the Blue Fox Drive-In, the airport in the area, farms? And are we going to have complaints from residents in this new development about light pollution from the Blue Fox, flight paths from the airport, smells and noises from the farms? Obviously, the utilities are coming from Oak Harbor, so that's going to have to be brought out. So, again, those are basically the questions I have. I'm not sure if I'm for it or against it yet, but I definitely am concerned that enough items need to be reviewed. How is this going to impact the area around, and not only the area around, but Oak Harbor itself? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Anyone else like to speak this evening? Okay. Seeing no other comments, I'll close the public involvement at this time. Commissioners, do you have any further questions, concerns?
Steve, I want to address one thing that was brought up and asked the question of you. Would all of the land need to be annexed into the city, or does it just need to avoid donut holes in the JPA? Do we need to annex all of that 50 acres between the current UGA and the proposed development?
From an annexation perspective, no. State law requires obviously contiguity, so we have to have parcels, a continuous string of parcels from wherever the city limits are now to wherever it is they are moving to. At a point is not enough, we know that much. It probably becomes more a question of the logical extension of utilities. Should we ever get to that point? I think those would be the questions that would be dealt with. One point that may help the Planning Commission as you think about this is that additional acreage that's in there, that has to count towards the capacity. So if we go through all of these steps and the answer is yes, you need more capacity, and the answer is no, you can't achieve that inside of the existing urban growth area. And so now the city and the county are talking about where do we go. That land, that is that bridge, if you want to think of it as that counts towards the capacity. That doesn't get zeroed out. And so that would be part of what would eat up whatever new capacity might be available. And I say that with all sorts of qualifiers on it, because we're nowhere near coming to that particular point in the process or that conclusion yet. But just a factoid for you to keep in mind.
I don't have any other questions, maybe some comments later.
One of the questions I have is, as far as our water capacity, as far as population growth and stuff like that, we already get all of our water from Skagit, the Skagit River, and then of course, as we already know. But with this 1,500 additional population-wise, our homes, which is a lot more population than just the homes, how is that going to affect our water and sewage, which we're just building a whole bunch of money on a new sewage treatment plant, but also with our water capacity? I know that's a lot, way down the road.
No, it's a great question, Mr. Pearson, and I'm glad that you asked it, because I think it dovetails on some of the comments that the audience members made about concerns about traffic and studies and those types of things. And so it's a great question for me to respond to. Any expansion to an urban growth area, certainly one of significant size, would require the city to relook at all of our utility master plans. So we'd have to look at our water system plan again. We'd have to look at our storm drain plan. We would reevaluate our sewer plan, and we would certainly reevaluate our transportation planning. In fact, the county has that expectation of us, even if we didn't have it of ourselves. It's clear in their communication to us that that's something that they know would be necessary. And so while nobody has answers to those questions today, those are very obviously questions that would have to be analyzed very carefully. And so you may recall that we update those plans on a fairly regular basis every 6 or so years. We are presently working on updating our stormwater plan. It was not that long ago that we finished our sewer plan. The water system plan was in there somewhere close as well. We'd have to relook at that. We'd have to understand what would extending our utilities to this particular location mean in terms of those different systems. What would be the requirements for additional infrastructure? What demands would we be placing on the system? Where might other improvements be necessary, not just in this area? So if you think about water, it's not all just about at the end of the pipe. It's how does it get there from where it's coming from. And so those would be questions that would have to be looked at through reevaluating our water system plan. Any projects which would come out of that then would have to make their way into our capital improvement plan, which the Planning Commission is very familiar with. And ultimately then those become projects which are necessary to support any development, whether it's this one or or any other. So a whole series of things would have to happen before anybody could speak to you intelligently about the answers to those questions, but there's very much a process to get there.
A couple of comments slash questions, I guess. Let me just pick up on what Cecil was just talking about with the water and sewer, though. And as you kind of alluded to, no matter where development happens, this process is going to have to be gone through, whether it happens in the current UGA, JPA, wherever. It's going to be an issue that has to be dealt with. The advantage, perhaps, to having a big developer come in and do this is that they pay for a lot of the infrastructure, do they not? I mean, that's my understanding, is that they are going to pay for the water lines to the property and the water lines that are built on the property.
That applies to not just big developers, it applies to any developer. So our code, like most codes, requires that the individual or individuals who are needing of that particular utility service are the ones who are responsible for extending that service. So if we think about a typical small subdivision somewhere, and the water and the sewer line stops here, and this is where their property is, they're required to extend that water and sewer line from where it stops to the farthest end of their property so that it's available for the next property. Again, that's sort of that idea of a logical extension of things. But they're also required to provide those meet those infrastructure needs inside of their project.
So I guess the question then is, it's not necessarily that this is going to be a huge financial burden to the city if whatever developer is going to develop this stuff is already paying for it.
The burden to the city is not typically in the construction cost associated with infrastructure, because that falls to the developer. Where the city ends up with a financial responsibility, and again, this is true for any project, whether it's one house or one office or a subdivision, we end up with the maintenance responsibilities. And so, as you all are well aware, our public works crews take care of the streets, the water lines, the sewer lines, and the storm drain lines. That's where our attendant costs come, not in the upfront infrastructure, but in the maintenance of that infrastructure.
So also, the question has come up numerous times about the capacity. And I've been following what's going on with the sewer plant fairly closely, and my understanding is that that is being built with room for plenty of expansion, and that our water share that is a right of the city is also significantly higher than what is currently used.
So for both, the short answer, yes. For both of those particular utilities, our look is not a 5-year look, it's not a 10-year look, it's not even just a 20-year outlook like we do for our regular comprehensive plan. We have a longer window that we look at for water and sewer. And so yes, we have the new sewer plant is designed with additional capacity, room for growth inside of that same footprint, I'll note. And then our water system also has room for growth in it. But that's also why we look at those plans on about every 6-year basis, so that we're always rolling that look forward as we move through time.
So let me talk a little bit about, or ask a little bit about the buildable lands analysis, because it's come up once or twice tonight, and it came up quite a bit yesterday. And the thought that we just did this, and I wasn't on the planning commission at the time the buildable lands analysis came forward, but I remember going to the county public hearings and speaking very adamantly that I thought it was flawed at the time. And once I came on the planning commission, you know that you and I have had this discussion about my thoughts on the buildable lands analysis. And an example, I live on a property that, according to the buildable lands analysis, could hold 5 homes. I'm not going to build 5 homes on my property, but the buildable lands analysis projects that that's what's going to happen. I see flaws in that, and I think that, well, let me get to my question, which is the buildable lands analysis flawed?
Is there more to the question?
Well, that's,
How about, is there a different question?
okay. Let me ask a different question then.
No, I'm just kidding.
You know my position on it, so it doesn't
Sure.
really matter what you say, I guess.
Yeah,
Let me
I've
ask
been
a
in
different
lots of
question,
conversations like that.
which is we've talked a lot about affordability of housing.
Sure.
We got a dozen lots up on Barrington Heights that have been vacant for 10 years. They're not going to be affordable houses up on those lots. The buildable lands analysis, is there any calculation that's done in the buildable lands analysis to account for that?
Yes, and so I'm gonna circle around and answer for you, but I'm gonna get there.
Thank you.
Do I think it's flawed? No. Do I think that there's always room to look at the methodology to try to figure out whether it's ground truth as best as it could be? Absolutely, I think that's a process that we should always engage in, is to figure out, is it as good a methodology as we can have? We can do a lot of things with crunching numbers, but there are a couple of things that there's no way for the model to account for. One of them is the question of time. So by GMA, we're required to plan for a 20-year horizon. We can estimate the population for that based upon established methodology. City and the county can agree this is the number that we need to plan for. But what we can't tell is whether you choose to sell your property or to develop your property in that 20-year horizon or not. There's no reasonable way for us to account for that particular possibility. So since we can't really deal with the question of time through the methodology, we try to use reasonable market factor. What other ways can we address that question of time, and maybe even a question of owner preference? So we probably all know people in town who have a particular piece of property. They've owned it in their family forever and a day, and as far as they tell us, they will never sell that particular piece of property. That's owner interest in making it available. I can't predict that. The county can't predict that when we look at that particular piece of property in the parcel map. So what we can do is to think about what might be the relative developability of parcels. And that's what the methodology is intended to do. So what we tried to do is say, okay, look, just because a property is exactly twice the size of the minimum lot size in the city of Oak Harbor doesn't mean that you're going to be able to get one additional house on that particular piece of property. The existing house might be right in the middle of the lot, right? It might be an oddly shaped lot. It might be a narrow lot, and where the house is at the front, but there's no room on either side to get a driveway to the back. And so we worked with the county to say, how do we account for these kinds of circumstances? And so in the countywide planning policies, that's where you see that table of lands that we're going to discount. Anything that's exactly 2 times the size of the lot, we're not even going to count that. We're just going to make the assumption that there's no way that that's going to develop. And then there's a sliding scale. If it's between 2 and 2.5 times the size, trying to account for all these different development possibilities and somehow accounting for time, we're going to say that 75% of those aren't going to be counted, and we're going to count 25%. And as you saw, the bigger the lot size gets, the more likely the model assumes that it will be able to be developed. We've also excluded those properties which historically have not counted as part of the capacity. And the classic example of that are properties which are held by religious institutions. Those properties, historically, once they own them, they stay in their ownership. You don't see them sold for development. And so we're taking those out of that. So we're trying to count those properties which we think have a reasonable chance of developing within 20 years, but there's no way for us to predict that time factor. So I'll finish where I started. City staff doesn't believe that the model is flawed, but we are open to hearing other comments, and we'd work with the county if we needed to re-examine the methodology.
Do you have any feeling that the factors that were used in the 2016 BLA have changed significantly enough to make them, to make it time to reevaluate it? I mean, they lay out a fairly compelling argument in their application.
The applicant is making the argument that that one or more of the thresholds has been reached. And so therefore, a reexamination of the BLA should take place. I think the county's materials have pointed out that while the employment threshold has been reached, it's a very low threshold. And since there is a fairly large excess capacity for the creation of jobs from a land perspective inside of the existing urban growth area, that the county's memo indicated that they did not believe that reaching that very, very low threshold was a reason to trigger a reevaluation of the buildable lands analysis. So that's sort of one part of that. The second part of that answer, I think, lies in, has there been a material change in the development within the community since we did that buildable lands analysis. And one of the things that we've put together that Tim is going to pull up here, I think, is we went back and just today looked at some numbers. Can we go to the full slide view on that, Tim, if we could, please? Great, thank you. So now, one of the things that we did just as an exercise to see what it sort of told us was most up-to-date information for residential activity, but we've gone back 5 years. So that is certainly time which precedes the buildable lands analysis, but also shows you what's under application or what's happening since the time the BLA was completed. So we're showing you 3 categories here: those things which are done through short plats, those things which are done through subdivisions, and those things which were pre-application meetings that have not yet materialized into either one of the other 2 categories. And I won't read all this to the Planning Commission, but the idea was to show you what level of activity is happening or not happening in our community when it comes to the construction of housing, and not just single-family housing. And I think that's an important part of the overall conversation, is that when we talk about capacity, that capacity is not 100% dedicated to brand-new, standalone single-family housing. Under GMA, we're required to plan for a range of housing for a range of individuals. So that may mean an attached townhome product. It may mean an apartment product. It might. So, and while we don't think about it in terms of ownership, we think about it in terms of densities. So it could be standalone single family, it could be attached single family, or it could be high density multifamily. We have to provide a range of opportunities to satisfy that capacity. So it's not a question of, is there enough capacity for a particular kind of housing? That's really not the GMA question. The GMA question is broader than that. So what this is showing you is what's just been happening in the last 5 years. And you can see that through projects which have been approved that maybe no permits have been issued yet because the applicant hasn't moved forward, or projects which were approved and construction has started, or something that we currently have under review right now, about 298 units are possible or are already online from this time frame that we're looking at. Then from a pre-application standpoint, and those are applications just like the name implies, it's before they've submitted the formal application, they're coming in to get a sense of what's going on, what are the rules on this particular piece of property, what are the infrastructure needs, all those kinds of questions. We've conducted a number of pre-applications in the last 2.5 years, and those account for about 280 units. Again, those have not moved to the formal application stage. But it doesn't mean that they're dead either. It just means that the applicant hasn't given us anything back yet. So, question of capacity then. Do we need more capacity? No one can answer that question without actually going through the analysis again, but I think it's reasonable to say that there has not been a significant passage of time with a significant number of units to have been constructed to have eaten into that capacity which we identified with the county last year.
Take another quick question on that topic. When you talk about capacity, there is absolutely no mechanism within there to talk about affordability, is there? Because while we may have capacity within the current UGA, if it's not affordable for developers or for home purchasers to buy, is that even remotely factored into the process?
It's not, and I think that's one of the tensions that you see in the Growth Management Act. And you're all asking very great questions that give me a chance to hit upon a number of subjects. So if we think about the Growth Management Act, there are a number of goals in there, right? One of them is to contain urban sprawl, right? That's why we have UGAs. Another one is to make sure we're providing enough affordable housing. Well, those goals are in conflict with each other almost all of the time. And yet somehow, pardon me, somehow we need to balance those goals. So the methodology itself doesn't crank in an affordability factor. I'm not aware of a way to do that. But just as a quick side note, affordability, as I know that you know, is not necessarily defined by new housing either. It can be in existing housing opportunities that are now made available to people who otherwise didn't have a chance at that particular housing level.
Let me just make some comments if I can.
Sure.
I appreciate all your comments. That's helpful. I'm concerned about the affordable housing issue. You know, I am concerned that if the city is locked into its current boundaries, that it's going to be impossible to build sufficient affordable housing for our needs. You know, we have a lot of people that are leaving the island every day because they can't live here. They can't spend the night here. They work here, but they can't spend the night here because they can't afford a house. They can't afford to rent. They can't afford to buy. Yes, traffic is a huge issue south of town. That's as much a state issue as it is a city issue. But I guarantee you, traffic north of town is every bit as bad. If anybody's driven over to Mount Vernon or Burlington, they know that those poor folks who are driving all the way to Cedar Woolley and back every day are having to put up with a lot of traffic that we can't even begin to imagine. So I'm concerned about that. I realize the traffic problems need to be solved. The affordable housing issue, though, you know, I'm not convinced that we can do it within the city limits. At yesterday's County Planning Commission meeting, a comment was made by one of the planning commissioners that she used to live in Boulder, and the city of Boulder had done a good job of constraining their boundaries and forcing developers to build inside the city limits. Well, just as a matter of curiosity, I looked up what the median house price in Boulder is. It's $687,400. You know, so we can fill in the city, but are we going to fill in the city and end up doing what Anacortes did, which is have all the lots filled? But, you know, for the last year, the median price of new construction in Anacortes, $622,000. The median price of new construction in the city of Oak Harbor since the beginning of this year for new construction, single-family homes, $357,000. How many houses under 200,000? 0. How many houses in Langley under 200,000? 0. How many houses in Anacortes under 300,000? 0. There's one house under 300,000 on all of Whidbey Island that was built in the last year, one single-family home. You know, we're not building affordable housing. We're not giving ourselves the opportunity to build affordable housing. We have a developer who is proposing something that, you know, should be able to come in with affordable housing. And I think that we need to take it seriously, and we need to at least discuss it. Nobody's asking bulldozers to move in tomorrow or next week or even next year. We're asking the county to talk about it, to consider it, to see if it's the right thing. Maybe it's not the right thing. Maybe it is the right thing, but it's something that needs to be discussed. And I think that we need to provide them with that opportunity. I just, I don't want us to be so afraid of things that might happen that we don't investigate whether, there's solutions to those problems. I don't want the process to get in the way. So, thank you. I apologize for getting in my soapbox.
I would like to make my comment, and that's all it is, just a comment. The document that you just provided us indicated the short plats, subdivisions, and pre-application items that have been out there for the last 5 years. We also know that a number of properties that have been in generations of families for a particular use no longer fit the family's desire. One of the recent ones, Marion Woods, that was a number of family members that owned the property that said, we want to do something with it. And it was our task to approve something that made sense, and we did. Okay, that was a property owner that it was in the county. They requested annexation into the city. It was directly adjacent to the city, so it was approved. We all suffer the same issues with traffic, and we just got this document last Thursday. We first knew about this new development when it hit the papers. From our standpoint, is all these same questions that are being talked about tonight are the same questions that I have. I drove out there tonight before I came here to look at the overlay. I saw the airport, I saw the farms. But what I'm seeing is that these large acreage, and I'm talking, you've got some that are in the family, they just have 5 acres. Other ones have 40 acres, but it's the same family. But that generation no longer can afford to use the land for what it's been used for the past generations, even one generation. The taxes go up. When our taxes go up, their taxes go up as well. So they're facing the same dilemma. Does this fit? I haven't made up my mind yet because I haven't seen nothing yet. All I've seen is a document that this is what they'd like to do. But I also know that document is in the county's hands at this point in time. Our job is to start thinking about all of these issues and how it would affect the city and all of us. So that's my comment.
A lot of the concerns that I heard here tonight are mirroring my concerns when I first heard about this project. In fact, Steve, I think you'll remember I thought the Whidbey Camino Land Trust was trying to protect that farmland. Mm-hmm. That was the direction I thought this was going, and obviously that fell through. Nobody is going to be protecting this farmland. I think it's going to be sold, and I think this is a great chance for us to talk about how that farm is going to turn into the future. The more information that I've gotten about this, the more I would approve seeing a master planned community rather than pockets of 5-acre triple wides scattered with spec homes, scattered with custom homes on that same land. I would like to see somebody put some real thought into developing it as a whole. Obviously, we're going to have traffic issues. We would have school and emergency service problems to deal with, or at least figure out how to expand those services. I'm not sold one way or the other on this, but I think the conversation needs to continue, and I think that we should be thinking long-term about how we are actually making the island work for us. I can think of numerous farms and fields and woodlands that I grew up playing in as a kid right here in town that are homes, and a lot of scattered developments in those places that aren't planned very well. And I like the idea of being able to to see one large community planned out very well that works for the citizens, provides some benefit to the city, alleviates some of our housing problems that we're seeing now. I think the conversation is a good one, and I hope this conversation keeps moving forward.
So if I may, just sort of as a final staff comment, picking up on a thread that I think I heard from several of the commenters, is that when we ask you to conduct the public hearing on October 10th, it's not a decision as to whether the project is approved or not. It is whether or not the Planning Commission would recommend to the City Council that they recommend to the county that the conversation continue. So most for your benefit as well as for the audience's benefit, you're not at a stage where you're being asked to approve a project. The question is whether or not you think it's something that the conversation should continue to take place. And we'll do our best to help you be prepared for that conversation on October 10th. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chairman Wassinger, I might recommend a 5-minute recess.
Sounds like a real plan.
All right, thank you.
5-minute recess. Thank you.
permission to go somewhere from my wife.
Permission, sir?
Her calendar's on the wall, my calendar's down here.
Ferrari, you're filling the gaps.
Yeah.
It could be like I am, 68 and gone through 3 5-year plans and still working. So I just said it working.
Is it time?
We'll see you guys Friday. All right. Thank you. Good to see you guys. Thanks for coming. Yes.
Is this GAC time?
Yes. Are you gonna work?
Well, that's CAC, right?
Yeah.
Oh.
At least that's what's up here on the top. He left.
No, he was out in the hall.
He said, forget it, I'm out of here.
Even the other plant, oh, they didn't leave, I thought maybe they left.
Ah, so they're coming.
Let's resume the meeting here. Item number C, Senior Planner Kat Kamak will walk us through the 2017 Comprehensive Plan Amendment, Park Plan Update.
Park Plan update. Good evening, Kamak Senior Planner. Just wanted to touch base with the commission on the park plan. We have it on every agenda because we're updating it. As most of you are aware that we had a joint meeting. Some of you attended that, and we discussed it real briefly at the pre-meeting. What we discussed at the meeting was all the goals and policies within the plan with respect to parks, open space, and recreation. We went through every goal, had a really good discussion. There were some good thoughts shared on how some of them could be updated, how some of them can be combined. Some of these goal statements have been brought forward from previously existing plans all the way back from 1965, so they are not anything new that was in the plan since 2008. So we discussed those. Some of them were obsolete, and the boards and commission decided that we could remove some of these goals. And so I'll have an updated copy of those goals at the next meeting, so all the commissioners can see some of the changes that we'll be going through as we go through the update. Also wanted to state we have a survey out, and we're getting some responses on that. We have approximately 220 surveys that we have input on. Nearly not as much as the number of surveys we had last time, so we're going to make another push for more surveys. We're going to let people notify people through the utility billing cycle in October, so you'll get a little slip in the utility bills about the park plan survey. There'll be a little QR code that people can use their phones and directly have a link. The survey can be taken on your phone. So we're hoping we'll increase the number of participants on that survey with the utility billing. We'll also probably reach out to the schools, try and get at least the high school kids who use the parks to also provide input in terms of their frequency of use and so on, so we'll get a gauge on that. Currently, we're looking at the survey, and I took a little peek at some of the results. Most of the people that have responded to the survey are more than 80% or 70% are between the age group of 35 and 65. So we're missing some of the other demographics, and hopefully this second push will give us a little change in that, and maybe with the school we'll get a little bit response from the younger generation as well in the park. So we'll continue to do that. So we'll come back with more updates in the next few months. What we'll go through, what I'm hoping to go through, is also the Tier 2 of the plan that has all the level of service analysis, the nuts and bolts of the plan in terms of numbers and level of service. So we'll go through some of that in the winter months. But the update will probably not happen in this cycle and before December. We'll probably carry that process over. It'll spill over to next year. We'll adopt the plan. The original plan was adopted in February, not as part of the comp plan. But the plan itself has Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, as I mentioned. We can adopt that plan at any time. When we do next year's comp plan amendment or finish it 2018, we'll take the policies that we adopted with the plan and put it in the comprehensive plan, and that'll be a comp plan amendment. So, so I'm hoping to have more discussions on that in the next coming months. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
To talk to the demographics of the survey, I've brought this up before. Keep in mind that utility bill mailings, they don't hit most apartments or most condominiums because most apartments provide water, and so the residents don't get a water bill. They don't see these things. So that may be why you're missing a lot of the younger demographic, because they're living in apartments or renting condos. I would encourage you to put it out on Facebook. That seems to be a good way of reaching people. I did that a lot with the Windjammer Park survey. I forwarded that to a ton of people on Facebook.
I am hoping that the link that I passed on to the commission, the city council, and so on, we encourage them to put it on their Facebook pages, so I hope they do that, and that is one way to do that.
Thank you.
And we have it on our Facebook page too, so, as Lisa reminds me. Thank you, Lisa. Any questions?
Any questions?
Yeah, one thing that jumped out at me as I was going through attachment 1 through the plan tables, when I got to the marina, there is nothing there, and I don't know if that was done on purpose or what's going on. But I know we have quite a few major projects that may need to be dealt with there, and I know the advisory committee is working on things with the hoist and the boat launch and potential breakwater repairs as they're failing. But I don't see anything in the next 6 years for capital project expenditures or anything else in the marina section. Can you elaborate?
I will, but I think you've skipped ahead to the next item on us already.
Oh, I may have.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
I'll leave a little a chance if anybody from the public want to comment on the on the park system. You can take comments. If not, I'll come back and give a short blip on the actual.
Do we have any public comment on agenda item C, comprehensive plan amendment park plan update? If not, I will move on to Senior Planner Kat Kamakin, agenda item D, 2017 comprehensive plan amendments. And this too is a public meeting.
Yeah. Thank you again. So we're getting close to the end of the 2017 amendments. We started off with quite a docket to tackle this year. And some of these discussion on these topics are still being discussed and under work, so not all of them will be complete this year. So as I mentioned earlier just a few minutes ago, the Parks Plan update is ongoing. It'll probably spill over into next year. The Capital Improvements Plan, however, some of the questions that came up, we'll try and tackle that. We do have that moving forward, so we have a draft of the tables and the projects in there. This is just to get the discussion started and the questions started. We'll still have maybe some slight modifications, not any major changes, but may have some slight changes as it comes forward to you in October. We have the environmental element. The environmental element is basically what we intended to do was to include the critical area maps into that section. And the maps have been provided. We go out and get the data from the state and federal agencies that have this information. The previous maps were done by a consultant, and they were done in a different format. We are updating it with our GIS layers, and we're doing it, most of it in-house. We've obtained most of the layers that we have. And we hope to move forward with that and adopt those maps into a comprehensive plan. Nothing is really being changed there. We're using some of the same layers in the data that was used in the past. Not much has changed in terms of these areas, so that shouldn't be much of a big difference from what we've had in the past. The economic development element, we kept that open because there were some discussions there was an ad hoc group that was meeting to discuss economic development opportunities in Oak Harbor. We have a few suggestions from them in terms of what would help kind of like move the economic development forward in Oak Harbor. But most of these ideas are somehow, I mean, our comprehensive plan has many ideas. They're good ideas. It's just they have identified a few of them to focus on given the current circumstances. So we're just going to try and keep that element open to see if we can strategize a little better, to see if we can make some adjustments to our policies to try and tackle some of that in the next 6 years maybe. So we're going to leave that open and continue that discussion. So maybe in the beginning of next year, we'll chat a little more about how we can tackle that. And of course, the urban growth area resizing, this is, again, one that appeared in the county's docket when we started the plan 2017. As Steve mentioned, it has something, it was in relation to changing something, the countywide planning policies, maybe considering the expansion of the joint planning area. So that has been left open, and as you know, that discussion is ongoing, so we'll leave that section of it open as well to see what comes out of it and whether we need to make any adjustments. So the two things that will probably come forward to you before the end of this year, which will be a public hearing either in October or November for you, is the capital improvements plan and the environment element to include the critical area map. So those are the two things that will come forward. The rest will spill over to next year. So that's all I have. Now, I know that there are questions. Absolutely.
I can remember it.
Absolutely.
So, Mr. Mann, I'd like to tell you that it was an oversight, but I can't tell you that. Pardon me. Yes, we have projects which need to be done in the marina. And the council just recently adopted a marina improvement plan. The key there is that to be in our capital improvement plan, as you probably know, it has a minimum dollar amount of $50,000 or greater, lifespan of 20 years, et cetera. We don't have any projects which exceed that $50,000 amount that we can afford. And so, yes, we have more significant projects like dredging or replacement of various floats. All of those are more expensive than what our revenue sources will allow us to pay for. So in the Marina Improvement Plan, we have a table of projects which are less than $50,000 that we believe that we can tackle. And so, but those projects don't qualify to get into here. So yes, we will be tackling as much of the maintenance as we can handle, but we lack the ability to fund any of the larger, more expensive projects.
Any other questions? Hal?
So on the first page, under streets of the tables, I see the Boyer Property Access Road is on there for 2019 for $560,000. That's that road up by the new park up on the corner of Facama and the highway. I'm kind of surprised to see that in there, considering we just approved the Transportation Improvement Plan last month, and it wasn't in the Transportation Improvement Plan, and it's a road, and it's in the streets for capital improvement. Why are we putting it in here if it wasn't in the Transportation Improvement Plan?
So this project would only take place if it was funded through a grant, and we're not actually pursuing RTPO grants or those federal dollar grants. We see this as a project which has economic development benefits, and so we would be pursuing and plan to pursue what's known as the Rural Economic Development Grant, or commonly referred to as the .09 grant. And so I think that was the rationale as to why we did not include it in the TIP, but I will check on that for you.
So are you saying that the TIP only includes things that are, whatever that funding source is?
The
a
federal
general
funding
fund?
one,
Yeah.
typically that we only have on there those ones which we will be seeking federal funds for.
I'm frustrated with this because it wasn't in the transportation plan that you guys spent a fortune paying Fair and Pierce to build, and now it's on here, so I just don't understand.
I can understand that. The challenging part is that there's no way to practically capture all ideas in a nice, neat box and say, okay, now we're going to plan for just these ideas and we're going to ignore everything else. And so from time to time, something shows up where you say, okay, there's a way for us to solve a particular problem, and here's how we could go about solving it. And that particular problem that's we're trying to solve there is how do we safely provide access for those properties up there, because the old driveways out onto the highway are non-conforming by the state standards and they are unsafe. But we can't leave people without access. And so several months ago, the council approved the establishment of an easement across our properties that would allow this street to be built. And then the idea evolved from there.
And I understand that, but, as I recall, it serves like 3 properties, all of which are commercial. And I know that one of the council members at the time asked the question of why would the people who own the commercial property not pay for the development cost of that rather than it being on the city's back, whether it's grant money or not?
That's a very real possibility, but one of the challenges that we see is because of where those properties are at relative to the APZs and the noise zones, they have very low intensity uses which are allowed under our zoning code. And those low intensity uses may not be able to support the cost of the street access to serve that property. And so we're kind of trying to figure out how do we do something that allows private property to be utilized so that so that it can realize it's some economic benefit. But when you talk about the uses which are allowed, they may not be able to, it may not pencil out to do all of the infrastructure. And this was one way, because it was across the city's property, that we thought we could help solve that problem. Because time after time after time, when people talk about doing something on those properties, they want to use that existing driveway, which is no longer going to be available. Yeah.
And I understand the need for the easement for that purpose, but the cost of the road itself seems to me like you're subsidizing commercial properties. It's not like it's a school or something where you have to provide access to school. This is a commercial property, so you're spending $560,000 potentially. And again, it may be grant money, that's great, but
well, part of an economic development strategy at times may be that you're putting in infrastructure as a primer for the pump, so to speak, so that something can happen. And whether that's a sewer line, and we've done that in the past, or whether it's water or street, things that cities do best from an economic development standpoint is infrastructure. So that's where this is going, but obviously this is at the very first stage. We have the hearing, we've heard your comments tonight. Ultimately, the council will have to decide whether they think that's a good idea or not. So good comments, though. Thank you.
Thanks. That's all I have.
Anything else? Thank you, Kat.
Thank you.
So there's a special meeting scheduled for October 10, 2017. The topic of the meeting will be public hearings on agenda items this evening, A and B. The meeting will begin at 7 p.m. and there will be no pre-meeting. Our next regular business meeting is slated for October 24th, 2017. Seeing that there's no further business, this meeting is adjourned.